Hello everybody, welcome to TwentyEA's latest webinar series where we'll be looking at the current state of the UK residential market and we'll be using the most up-to-date data available. We're filming this in early August, so we're using our very own data which is accurate as of the end of July. I'm delighted to say we've assembled a star-studded lineup today. We've got Tom Bill, Head of UK Residential Research at Knight Frank. Hi Tom.
Hi Paul.
We've got Megan 18, Operations Director for Location, a top estate agent in London, and recently elected Vice President of Arla.
Hello.
And our very own Stuart Ducker, Strategic Solutions Director at TwentyCi.
Hi Paul.
And Stuart, I'm going to start with you actually. So I keep hearing the same word regarding the sales market, and that's resilient. And I think the sales market really is resilient, isn't it? All things considered. Can you perhaps just give us a bit of an overview of where we are in the market at the minute?
Sure, yeah, no problem at all. One of the first things to say is that the supply of properties, so those come into the market for sale, have actually increased. So they're about 5% higher than 2022 as it stands at the minute on a like-for-like comparison between January and July. Now, demand has fallen by 16% in 2023, but it was always going to, because 2021 and 2022 was such astonishing years. It is lower than the pre-pandemic year as it stands at the minute by about 8%, that kind of order of magnitude. Now, we, as people know who have been shopping for property, we've had a stock shortage and it's been pretty difficult to try and find a property to live in sometimes. Now, that available stock shortage with the increase in supply and the reduction in demand has actually abated at the higher levels of transactions, but we still have a big problem with properties under £200,000. So if you was a buyer of those properties now and you was looking to purchase one of those, there's 78,000 less properties in the UK than there was in 2019, which is an unbelievable stat. So moving on, so the time to sell has risen slightly, so it looks large at an average of about 61 days in 2023, but we must remember that that's still 18% lower than pre-pandemic norms. The time to progress a property, that's going from a sale agreed to an actual completion, is still far too high. It's come down slightly by a few days over the last couple of months, but it's still 4.1 months. In terms of exchanges in 2023 or completions in 2023, they've fallen by about 20%, and the problem there was effectively created by the mini budget. So those sales agreed in Q4 of 2022 would have been the actual completions in Q2 of 2023, and we've seen those reduce considerably as a direct effect of the sales agreed not happening because of the mini budget. But this year, our forecasts show that we will still achieve more than 1 million transfers in property in 2023. Asking prices are still rising, both at an instruction level and an exchange level. However, transfer prices, as we know, have started to fall slightly, but we're still talking about very low single digits, and it depends on which market you're looking at as to how that goes. One of the biggest changes is that hybrid agents, or the so-called hybrid agents, have lost market share. So they are now only 5.7% of total new instructions, which is 26% lower than 2019. So all in all, it's holding up quite well. Better at both extremities of the market. So the bit in the middle is the bit that seems to be getting squeezed, and they're the people that are affected by the cost of living crisis, I guess. But at the low end, if you're a first-time buyer, what's your choice? You have ear-bleedingly high rentals at the minute, or if you can manage to scrape a deposit together, while interest rates have risen and mortgage rates have risen, it still makes commercial sense for people to try and do that if they possibly can. And at the top end of the market, I think that's going okay as well. So London sales agreed up until very recently were up on last year. So it's actually, by and large, not bad news, and certainly not the disaster, the housing crisis that we hear very often in the media.
Great, thanks, Stuart. Was it interesting that you're forecasting around 1 million transactions? Because I've seen some pretty low figures from various commentators. But let me perhaps pick up on a few of those topics. So let's start with the demand side, shall we? So we measure demand as the number of sales agreed. Now, we are 16% down on last year, but we know last year was probably an unusual, remarkable year. July's figures, though, that we are 21% down compared.
Correct,
so
yeah.
it does look like that's got slightly worse. Now, this is probably due to the overriding factor of mortgage rates. But Tom, have you got a view on this demand side, what the reasons for it being down, or perhaps what we think it will be like for the rest of the year?
Yes, Paul. I think overall the market, I would agree, is resilient. It's not particularly, it's certainly not on its knees at the moment, but neither is it really firing on all cylinders. And I think what you have to bear in mind is the context for all of this. And the context is that we've transitioned back to a more normal long-term interest rate environment, which was not unexpected. I think the journey, that transition that we've made has been a lot bumpier and a lot more volatile than most people would have liked. We had the mini budget where Liz Truss and Chancellor went too far too fast for financial markets. The Bank of England has recently been accused of doing too little too late. And so you've had this transition back to longer term normality that was always coming. People knew about it, but it's just been a very bumpy one. And so markets don't like uncertainty. Buyers and sellers don't like uncertainty. And at the moment, I think people are getting their head around the fact, slowly getting their head around the fact that the last 14 years of ultra low rates was the exception. It wasn't the rule. And so we're coming back to a period where things are, people talk about the new normal. It looks very much like the old normal for anyone with a memory that stretches further back than 10, 20 years. So that's the background. That's what's happening. And I think buyers and sellers are just now at their own pace coming to terms with that in different parts of the country, different price points. It's happening in different ways, and we can talk about that. London, for example, is proving more resilient, I think, because it didn't really do an awful lot during the pandemic, and prices didn't run away with themselves. So London, central London, still looks, relatively speaking, decent value for some buyers. So I think that's what's happening. Demand's obviously been curbed by what's happening in the mortgage market. But the one other thing I think is worth bearing in mind is never to underestimate the amount of people that move because they need to. And the market is driven by people that move because of schools and because of jobs and that sort of thing. And that, along with a series of other factors, again, we can look into, I think is what's kept things more resilient than I think people would have expected.
Yeah, great. Well, let's perhaps just touch on interest rates and obviously they impact mortgage rates. At the time of filming, the Bank of England's just had its 14th consecutive increase. They're at currently 5.25%. Now, this is, I imagine people that are coming off 2-year, 5-year fixed rates are kind of stressing because their mortgage repayments are going to go up. People perhaps that are used to these ultra low rates, younger people, think it's terrible and are having conversations perhaps with estate agents. And a lot of people watching this today are going to be estate agents and having these kind of conversations with their clients. Now, does the panel have any advice for perhaps homeowners or who are coming off their fixed rates or new sellers to how to deal with these kind of higher mortgage rates?
I would say, I'm not going to name any particular company here, but stay very close to your broker because you need to be on top of what's happening in the market at the moment because it's moving very quickly. What the Bank of England does next is going to be tied quite closely to what this month's inflation reading is going to be. Is it going to be better than expected? It was last month. The month before that, it was worse than expected, and everyone threw their arms in the air and thought it was going to be, rates were going to have to stay higher for longer. I would keep a close eye on the jobs market. The jobs market is what's driving core inflation, and that core inflation is what the Bank of England is really having trouble bringing back down again. So ironically, at the moment, we have a position where the stronger the jobs market, the worse it is for the housing market in some ways. In other ways, not so much. So it's a case really, I suppose, of at the moment, we're nearing that peak. We're almost at that inflection point. It's quite a critical moment in some ways. So it's worth doing your homework and keeping very close tabs on what's happening in the mortgage market.
Touching on kind of fall throughs and price changes as well. So actually fall throughs, I think, Stuart, I'm right in saying are actually less in terms of volumes than last year.
Yeah, the volume of fallen throughs has definitely fallen and they're pretty similar to pre-pandemic, really. However, the rate of fallen through has risen slightly, but you're talking about in the order of 26% of properties that do fall through, which still means, you've got 75% of properties that are transacting. And most of the ones that do fall through, they resell in the same cycle. It's not like they come off the market and get withdrawn. So that's what's happening with fallen throughs. Price changes, So when you list a property for say £500,000 and then changing the price to £480,000, they've definitely increased in 2023 and they've doubled. And on a graph, that looks quite scary comparing it to 2022 until you realise that they're actually the same levels as a normal market, which occurred in 2019.
And to an extent, do you think there was probably that middle ground where vendors' expectations were up here, where the market was changing, and actually there was probably properties going on price slightly too high and having to be reduced. But
yeah, I think that's fair to say. I mean, if I was shopping for a new property now, I would certainly expect a discount on the price certainly from the original advertised price, without a shadow of doubt. But that's no different to what it always was, pre-pandemic. And Tom was talking about interest rates there. I remember being lectured by an economics lecturer in the late 80s who went to her broker and asked them to quote her for 15% interest rates. And they laughed at her. And eventually they gave her a quote and she said, yes, that's okay, I can afford that. And that's what happened during that time a few months later. We're not in the same situation as we were in the global financial crisis, because people own more of their property than they did then, by and large. There's larger equity involved. So I don't think we're going to see a huge level of repossessions like we saw in 2008, 2009. I think it's just the case that you need to shop around, as Tom says, stay close to your broker and get the best deal that you can. Probably locked in for a reasonable amount of period, because while Andrew Bailey says Governor of Bank of England, he doesn't expect interest rates to rise further before the end of the year, he also doesn't expect them to fall. So it's looking like this is the new normal for a period of time, at any rate.
Yeah, great. We've touched on property transactions, which obviously the estate agents looking here, that would be really good. That's what they're interested in, really. Because a severe drop in transactions really impacts their business. Perhaps the general public are more focused on property prices. And actually, if we look at the latest HPI figures and compare the most recent completion figures we've got for May 23, and if we compare that to September, just before the mini budget, which was the peak of the prices, we've only had a house price fall over that period of 2.3%.
Yeah.
Now that is remarkable. If you read the news or read the paper, you'd think we were double digit crashing, and that is such a small decrease. I think the market's done remarkably well. Now the prices may fall further. We've got more data to come as the months go on. But Tom, I find that remarkable that it's such low, given everything we know about interest rates, mortgage rates, and the general economy.
It is. I mean, we're forecasting around 5% decline this year.
Yeah.
If that happened, prices would still be around 13-14% higher than they were before the pandemic. So we saw that very strong growth. And it's worth bearing in mind, I think, yes, we're coming back to this normal interest rate environment, but we're also coming down from the highs of the pandemic. And so we're seeing that friction that Stuart mentioned, buyers wanting tomorrow's prices, sellers wanting yesterday's prices. That's currently being worked through. But overall, for strong double-digit price declines to happen, I think you need to see a wave of distressed selling. And I don't think the banks are going to be, calling in to the same extent they did during the financial crisis. That's often used as the yardstick for anything that goes wrong. And there's lots of differences between now and then. The banks are in a much better position than they were then. They're encouraged to show forbearance by the government, which I think they will by and large. The job market's is strong. Wages are set to outpace inflation, we read today in the papers. And I think the popularity of fixed rate deals in recent years means you're not going to see this sudden lurch of the whole market down when interest rates rise. You're going to see an unlucky group of individuals who are having to remortgage this year, or those that are having to buy. But actually over time, it's going to be a gradual, the pain will come in gradually, I suppose. So yeah, the result for house prices is going to be, I think, less dramatic. We're also looking at around 5% next year as more people do roll off those deals. But we're not anticipating any cliff edge moment for the market.
Yeah. And just to touch on that, without that distressed selling, as you say, there is a fundamental reason why I don't think it can go any further. And that's that there is just a shortfall of houses in this country. And And I think I read something recently that we're for about 4.3 million houses in terms of short for what we need. And I know the government have got their targets, which they miss every year, but without that new supply of housing, it's kind of economics, isn't it?
It is economics, but I would say even with that new supply of housing, you've got to question the economics. You've got the government wanting to build 300,000 homes a year, 25 million homes in the country. How is going from 200,000 to 300,000 going to bring down house prices? It's not. It's a live political issue. It's an emotive issue, understandably. But when you examine the economics of some of these arguments that are going backwards and forwards about whether we build 200,000 or 300,000, we'll build 300,000 if the demand is there. It's not necessarily at the fault of the planning system, which is always held up as a huge obstacle for the house builders. The demand has to be there, number one. And number two, we have to be conscious that another 100,000 homes a year isn't going to make a difference to house prices. The market is set by supply and demand, and that's the reality. People might not be comfortable with that entirely, but that's the reality of the situation.
Yeah, I agree. And Megan, just to come to you, you're obviously an estate agent in London. What kind of conversations are you having with sellers at the minute, and what's the market like for you?
I think it's really important that actually when you listen to all that data that you've just provided, and also what you've just said, that actually it just shows the value of an estate agent right now, because you could get completely freaked out looking at the media, but actually this is where we find our value. The conversations that we're having is much of the same. It starts with a panic, and it's almost like a soothing conversation that you're having to do. I think that's why as an industry, we've now got to almost be united, because we kind of write the narrative at this point. If we're not, showing people that actually you're absolutely spot on, we're nowhere near mass destruction of our industry. So let's all keep that united front. But the general conversations really are around cost of living. I mean, we're seeing a huge lack of supply across both sectors, both sales and lettings. But I think you're right. We welcome properties of all tenure for homeowners, for social housing, for the private rented sector. But yeah, you're right. 300,000 it's a drop in the ocean, isn't it? Mm.
And I think now more than ever, the role of an estate agent is so important for that advice. There's plenty of sources of data out there. We're one of them. The purpose of today is not to plug our own business. There's plenty of data providers out there, but I think the estate agent really needs to get into the detail of these stats. Now we're doing this across the UK. Obviously, there'll be regional variances and differences. So I think it's really, really important for an estate agent to fully understand what's happening in their local town, their local marketplace, and be that voice of reason and advice, because that will help them stand out over their competitors who probably don't know as much of them, and that will stand them in good stead to still have a successful year, even if transactions drop slightly.
I think as well, you've got to think about your younger team members. A lot of them have only worked through this sort of slightly bonkers market where, things are selling quicker than you can pop to the shops to buy a sandwich. So I think making some investment in training of your staff to understand what this actually means. But you're right, we've had a decade of almost free money. It was never going to last. It was like a little bubble that we've now got to pop and start again with.
Right. Well, time will tell what happens in the second half of the year, but I think in summary, the sales market we're pretty happy with, and it's not as bad as perhaps some people are saying.
I think just make one final point, picking up on what Megan said. Yes, you have all these indices that come out, the nationwide, the Halifax. It tells you the UK national picture. It's 4%, it's 5%. Nowhere really, that doesn't really necessarily tell you very much about what's happening on your street. And I think it's worth bearing in mind the housing market is made up of tens of thousands of housing markets, and that's the way I think it should be viewed. And the national figures, it's almost like a small business owner looking at the GDP numbers. They're useful. They can tell him what direction the economy might be going in, but not going to tell him necessarily whether his business is going to make more or less money, because it's all it's not very much on a case-by-case basis. So handle the data with care, I suppose, is the other message.
Yeah,
local estate agents, that's what you need, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, they know the data in their own marketplace effectively.
Well, they should do.
Hopeful.
Right, so we've covered sales. I want to jump into the letting sector now, because it's perhaps a bit more of a gloomy picture without being too depressing. Stuart, we've looked at the lettings data year to date. Can you just kind of tell us where we are, please?
Yeah, I think there's two massive issues for lettings. which the government really need to grab hold of and get this resolved as fast as possible. Arguably, it's probably their policies that got us to the place where we're at the minute. But I think if you think about this from a human perspective, if you're looking to rent right now, you've got two major issues. Firstly, the stock just isn't there. So the availability of rental properties is at an all-time low. I mean, it's the lowest we've ever seen, and we've been monitoring this data since 2009. It's fell by 11.5% on last year, and it's fell by 35% in 2019, and particularly at the low end of the marketplace, it's absolutely punishing. So if I was looking to rent a property for under £800 per calendar month, let's say, in 2019, there's 102,000 properties less than there was in 2019 than there are today to actually rent. I mean, that is crazy. And, 25,000 of those have disappeared in the last year alone. So the first problem for a renter is, just the availability that's in the marketplace at the minute. Yes, supply is rising slightly, but it's a bit of a drop in the ocean. Supply has risen 6% so far in 2023, excuse me, compared with 2022. The second issue, of course, is affordability of rental properties. So where, it's just supply and demand, where you get undersupply and lots of demand, the price goes up. And unfortunately, that means that our let agreed prices are at an all-time high. So 9% up on 2022, 24% up on 2019. I think the London market is slightly different from that. And most people talk about the very, very high rents in London, but you have to bear in mind, yes, they've risen sharply over the course of the last couple of years. But before then, they were in the doldrums for quite some time. So you're just seeing them catch up, basically. But yeah, as I said, two major issues, affordability and availability. And what's that's meant, we have a special source of data which nobody has, which enables us to measure the length of residency of renters. And we've seen that increase. So in 2019, that was 3.6 years on average. People were staying in rented properties. It's now 4.8 years. So that's problems for estate agents, because it means the turnover of the property stock is no longer there in many places.
Yeah, and yeah, I completely agree. It's really tough for renters at the minute, and I think there's an assumption that actually landlords are profiting from that, but I'd argue that it's lose-lose at the minute in the current state. I don't think it's a good market for renters, and I don't think landlords are having a great time either. Megan, as perhaps our rental expert, would you? It's perhaps a bit emotive. Would you say the private rental sector is broken?
Yeah, I think the system's definitely broken. I think everyone agrees with that quite comfortably, I think.
Yeah.
It's what you just said about landlords. We have to remember that landlords are not immune from increases of interest rates. And then we have what they did with the Section 24, which is the taxation of landlords, means that actually to be a landlord is no longer really profitable. Now, whatever people want to think about it, people don't make investments to not make money, and if you're not making money on your investment, then you will look to move on. So then we suddenly get more and more issues. Yeah.
And Tom, are you finding evidence of landlords leaving the sector, and which obviously worsens the supply issue even more?
Yes, I mean, there has been for several years now. I think the government, again, property has been used as a political football by the government. Landlords have been demonised. There's not many votes in supporting landlords, and so that unfortunately has had the knock-on effect of hurting tenants now, because as Stuart said, rents are rising so fast, availability so low. So it's going to remain a live issue. I'm sure as we run into the election, we're getting all sorts of ideas, such as rent caps being talked about. Don't think that's probably an awful lot of evidence that they do much of any effect at all. So it will remain this issue. I think if there's any, and maybe slight message of hope, and it might be something that we're starting to see a little bit in central London, where owners are a little bit more discretionary in whether they buy or sell. We are starting to see more stock come back from the sales market to the lettings market. We're seeing a growing number of accidental landlords instructions in the lettings market, with the highest in July since October 2020 and Knight Frank. So that reversal is underway. I'm not sure it'll happen to a huge extent across the whole country, and arguably it might happen in slightly higher value markets first. But it's starting to happen as the sales market wobbles. Owners are thinking, if they can, they're thinking, well, I'll let it out for a couple of years.
And do we have a viewpoint on rental prices? Obviously, Stuart touched on it, they're rising and rising, but this affordability issue, surely they can't keep rising, can they? Because it's just going to become unaffordable to rent.
Yes. I mean, you'd expect affordability to put the brakes on further price increases. But, what else do you do? We've seen a scenario whereby, some of the largest companies in the UK have come in and said, right, okay, well, we want to own a third of the private rental market. So the so-called build to rent. And we found that that's not necessarily the answer, and many of those companies are now backing away from that. We work with a few companies that are now starting buy to rent operations. So they're buying existing property stock that's in the marketplace at the minute, and then re-renting that out for renters. But without, frankly, a massive increase in supply nationwide, so prices may rise less than they have been in the past because of affordability issues, but there's still that trade-off between supply and demand. The landlord has to pay 6.2% interest rates or higher than that if they have 100% mortgages. So at the end of the day, I can't really see it abating that much, if I'm honest with you, and it's just going to get more and more difficult for renters to find anywhere. I mean, I do remember times where you were marching around streets looking for stuff, even in the student market, which is fairly specialist, for example. If you're renting stuff in Manchester, it's almost impossible to actually find a place as it stands at the minute. And when you do, you're paying very, very, very high rents for that. And unless you get a huge increase in supply, where I'm afraid build to rent is probably not the answer, going back to we can only do, the government, I think its highest within 2019, 2020 on new house builders were, and that was 243,000 properties in that year. It's just not enough, basically. So, we need to try and encourage more landlords back into the market.
And how do we do that? How do we improve that? Is it possible without government intervention or not?
I think it's going to be pretty tricky. I mean, realistically, as we've already touched on, it's not really particularly profitable to be a landlord. The interest rates are through the roof. I think the only way that that's really going to happen is if someone's got a lump of cash really at the moment. I think that's a fair assumption, that property is a fairly safe place to put lumps of cash still. So I think that's not going to go away. I think that we're seeing, just touching back quickly on the whether the supply and demand and reaching that point, we're already seeing it. Tenants can't afford it already. We're getting a huge increase of guarantors needed for properties, which has never really been the case. Certainly with the high wages of London, we've not really needed to do that. That's become more and more prevalent. So I think we're already getting to that ceiling point of that. But without the government really accepting that we need a mixture of different tenures across all different, we're a mixed tenure country. We need it. And we've seen in Scotland, especially from the statistics that you've shown, that Scotland's been massively impacted, and they've got pretty much what the renters reform bill is going to look like. They've pretty much got already locked in, and they've got rent caps currently at the moment. It's not looking great in Scotland, and the statistics are backing that up.
Yeah.
I think, yes, the government has disincentivised landlords over the last 5-6 years, or perhaps longer. It would arguably need to remove some of those disincentives to attract more landlords back into the market. I'm not politically, that's probably not hugely beneficial for anybody to do at the moment, particularly in the run up to the election. But you look at the build to rent sector that perhaps isn't fulfilling, isn't answering all the questions, but it hasn't needed any incentive to come in. It's come in because the demand is there. Again, it's fulfilling demand. So you're back to that argument. How much does the government need to intervene in a market that does self-regulate? It might not self-regulate very quickly, but it does self-regulate. And we've seen it in recent years with the build to rent, which is finally sort of getting some traction in this country, because it's, the tenure profile of the country is changing, the demand is there, the demographic incentives are there. So arguably the government should sort of take a step back and let the market, get on with it.
Great. Well, I think we'll leave it there. So thank you, Tom, Megan, Stuart. I think just to summarise, I think we're all cautiously optimistic about the sales market. Perhaps not as bad as we feared a few months ago. Lettings, there's real challenges, and I think they're going to continue for a while. But yeah, it's been great to hear your thoughts today. Some really good tips and advice and some insight into the industry. And thanks for joining. We'll see you next time.